Requesting connection. Established. Encrypted. We're live. The show you've been asking for. Advice, technology, and community. Linux first, all others second. This is Ask Noah.
Live from Altispeed Technologies, the Ask Noah show starts right now. This is the show where we came to do all the things on Linux they said couldn't be done and take your questions on how to do the same. The phone lines are open this hour. To be a part of the program, it is a free call, 1-855-450-NOAH. That's 1-855-450-6624, or send an email to live@asknoahshow.com. My name is Noah Chalaya. I am your host. Delighted to be here with you as another episode of the Ask Noah show kicks off this hour. Joining me, my co-host, Mr. Steve Evans. Welcome in, sir.
You still loving the cold, Noah?
Oh, mate. Now the air has legitimately begun to hurt my face, and so we're full on winter season. But it's okay. I don't think about it. I'm a nerd. I stay inside. The HVAC outside, very unpredictable. Automation doesn't really respond. Temperatures drop. It's not good. I want to start us off this evening, Steve, by a question that came in via the Geek Lab. La Cucaracha 123456 says, "Hey, I have a Pixel, and I think the screen died. The Calyx OS group thinks that it's hardware. Has anyone had luck at somewhere like YouBreak-iFix getting screens repaired?" So, Steve, I know you're not much of a phone guy, but have you ever gotten a screen repaired on a phone?
I call my brother-in-law. That's what I do.
Okay.
Send it to him.
Is he's one of those people that likes digging in and pulling little parts apart?
He's pretty good at it. He's replaced a couple of screens for us between my wife and I in the, 2 decades or so that I've known him.
I'll do laptops. I've not dug into phones. The thing, ever since we started gluing phones together, and it now involves a heat gun. Well, actually, depending on the MacBook, it requires us too. But you end up using a heat gun to melt the adhesive and then very carefully, very delicately pry all of the components and various things out of the case so that you can get to the battery or screen and replace it and then put it back. I'll tell you something else, and I don't know, specifically where you live, La Cucaracha 123456, but if there's a Batteries Plus, and maybe they call it Batteries Plus bulbs now, I believe they do screen repairs. You can bring it in, you drop your phone off, they'll fix it. I think there's also like mobile shops that will do that. And so, yeah, I would recommend giving it a shot. The other thing you could potentially do, a bit more risky maybe, but you could look on eBay. Oftentimes when I have a thing that I want repaired, it doesn't seem to matter how esoteric the thing is. There's somebody somewhere that has a shop, and typically they'll have a listing on eBay and, $20-25, whatever it is, plus the cost of the parts, and they will fix and or repair your thing. And if they can repair high fidelity cassette recorder players from the 80s and 90s, and there's people out there repairing those, I'm sure there's somebody repairing cell phones. They're much more popular than cassette recorders at this point. So I would trust those things. I don't know, there's a whole lot to lose. And if you ask them to replace the phone or the screen, and for whatever reason it's unsuccessful, then I would just tell them, what would I pay you for? You didn't, fix the screen. And if the phone winds up in the trash, it's not useful to you without a screen anyway, is it? So I might start there. Our first email comes in today from Araya. Araya writes in and says, "Hi, Noah and Steve. I've got a split DNS setup. Inside my LAN and my router. Inside my LAN, my router hijacks my DNS requests for my domain and points them to an internal caddy reverse proxy, which forwards onto the correct services. Outside my LAN, I make some of my services available through Cloudflare. It's a tunnel and does not involve the caddy's reverse proxy. Starting a few months ago, I've started to get SSL error unrecognized name alerts while inside of my LAN. Accessing the services that are available through Cloudflare outside of my LAN services works fine. After digging a bit, it looks as though Firefox 129 turned on HTTPS DNS records, different from DNS over HTTPS. When I turn off HTTPS DNS records in Firefox with about:config, go to native HTTPS query and change that to false, everything works fine. I'm guessing that the issue is that Firefox tries to use the external HTTPS DNS records instead of my internal A records, but there are some mismatches between them and the caddies SSL cert. Theoretically, I could turn off HTTPS DNS records to all my clients, but I'd like to solve this in a central way. How would you go about solving this? My router runs OpenWRT. Thanks again for the great show and the advice. Araya. So, Steve, what do you know about DNS over HTTPS or HTTPS DNS, and how do you spoof that?
I don't really know a whole lot, to be honest with you, in terms of like how you would spoof this. I also can't reproduce this, but I'm not running anything as complicated like this. But I did check in the about preferences, and native HTTPS query is true on all of the browsers that I have access to, and all of the stuff that I run locally works fine in and out of the house. I'm not doing anything with the Cloudflare tunnel though, so I'm not sure if that's the same case. So I'm not sure. What do you think, Noah?
Well, here's where my mind goes with this question. I look at this and I think, okay, are we maybe not addressing the real problem? Are we maybe trying to work around the real problem? So what if we tried this on for size? What if we said all the DNS queries, all of them, are going to go through the Cloudflare tunnel? And if we're inside the LAN, those requests are still going to go through the Cloudflare tunnel. We are just going to use hairpin NAT. And so when those requests come out and it resolves to its own public IP address, we enable hairpin NAT on OpenWRT so that it accepts that traffic from the public side. And then you're always resolving to the same IP address. It's just when you're inside, it's making it's coming full circle to you. When you're outside of the LAN, it's finding its way back to your home.
That's interesting. Now that you mention it, you've been using hairpin NAT for quite a long time that I completely forgot about, which may be burying this issue, so to speak, mostly because for things like Nextcloud, I want to be able to take the phone in and out of the network and use the same URL. And in order to make that happen, you need to do something like hairpin NAT. So that's an interesting solution. I'd be interested to see if that is actually working.
Tiny says in the Geek Lab, you could use Blocky or AdGuard Home, which supports DOH and DOT. I'm not sure if you need to configure DOH in Cloudflare, but you could also use Sinkhole, Cloudflare's DOH server. So hopefully that gives you something to go after. If that doesn't answer your question, or for any reason, if those solutions won't work for you, hey, reach out to us, and we'd love to circle back to it. Michael writes in with a response to Windows S Mode. So this, if you missed last week, I was talking about Windows S Mode, and this is, you might remember a few years ago, there were some devices that were sold specifically with only Windows S Mode. Didn't really pay a whole lot of attention to them, not really interested in subsidized Windows hardware. It came back to bite me in a bad way, insofar as I'm now getting clients that presumably at one point purchased a Windows 10 license for a computer that was originally purchased to run Windows 7, or for in whatever mechanism didn't have the Windows 10 key embedded into the motherboard. And when you go to reinstall Windows 10, those computers are coming back in Windows S Mode. And Windows S Mode will only let you execute software from the Windows Store. And so I was lamenting about my challenges with Windows S Mode. Michael writes in to say, FYI, it's a free one-time switch. As far as I know, you'll stay on Windows 10. I don't have a direct experience since I stay away from Windows and especially S Mode unless I'm doing tech support for someone else. And then he links to Microsoft and how to switch out of S Mode. So I tried that on some of the machines that I had run into, and the problem that I ran into is when I try to switch it out, it says enter in a Windows 10 license key, thus leading me to the conclusion that if the license key is built into the motherboard, it doesn't have that issue and it just works. And if it doesn't have a Windows 10 license key built into the motherboard, you ask this. But here's the larger thing I want you to keep your eye on as the episode rolls on. What I want you to pay attention to is the level of friction Microsoft is placing in front of its own users to use their product. So if you buy a Macintosh computer, an Apple laptop, Apple is just going to give you the software, latest version of the software, to run on their computer. Now, at some point, they'll stop updating it, but you'll still be able to use all of the software that you were able to use at the time that you bought the computer. In the Windows case, unless it came with Windows 10 and or has a TPM chip to upgrade to Windows 11, Well, first, let's start there. If it does have a TPM chip and it's capable of upgrading to Windows 11, unless you know how to escape out of the out-of-box experience and set it up cold, you're going to have to create an online Microsoft account. And, oh, by the way, you're going to need internet to be able to set the stupid thing up. Additionally, if you don't have Windows 10 or Windows 11, if you don't have a TPM chip, now you're stuck with either the Windows 10 key that's hopefully embedded in the motherboard or what? You can't execute little executables. That's the reason people run Windows, is to run esoteric software. So from my point of view, Microsoft is shooting themselves in the foot. If you want a good experience, you're better off with a Linux box or a Chromebook than you are with an older Microsoft Windows computer. And by the way, as of last count, this is as of a few weeks ago, there's roughly half of the computers that have been upgraded from Windows 10 to Windows 11. So you're either choose to believe that those computers are all Windows 11 capable and have TPM chips in them, and people just haven't gotten around to clicking the button yet. Or you choose to believe those computers are not capable of Windows 11, and come October 25th, 2025, you're going to have a whole bunch of people and a whole bunch of IT nerds running around trying to figure out what they're going to do because they're running out of time to get a thing that's supported. I want you to keep in mind of what's happening in the Windows world as we talk about some of the struggles that are in the Linux world, because I think it'll place it into perspective for you. Charlie writes in and says, "Good day, everyone. With the end of the year approaching, it could be a good opportunity to look into backup solutions for photos, movies, and various media downloaded on our computers, laptops, and mobile devices. I came across this hosting company, which is mentioned on the Mastodon network, Crunchbits. You can learn more at crunchbits.com. They're offering cheap storage VPS packages. For $6 a month, it'll get you 2 terabytes of hard drive storage. $12 a month gets you 4 terabytes of hard drive storage. Would this make a good cloud do-it-yourself server solution?" And then he links to Crunchbit and VPS. "What's the best way to back up photos, clips, and data for the long term? And with the 2 to 4 terabyte 3.5-inch drives and only power, if it only powers up every 3 to 6 months, you leave it in a cupboard or blank Blu-rays or discs." So, Steve, when you're looking at backing your data, well, actually, you're still a Spider Oak, right? Is where you're doing your cloudy backy thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's our tertiary backup for sure, right? It's the off-site version of, very slimmed down version of the stuff that we back up. So critical photos and stuff like that, because cloud storage is really expensive compared to, $130 on Black Friday for a 10 terabyte drive. So, so we have a small subset of stuff going up to Spider Oak.
So, okay, all right, so let's step through it this way. First of all, I want to relay a conversation that I overheard. It was a young lady in her 20s, and she worked for an organization. I was doing technical support, and we get into the conversation of storage on her phone. And so we're talking about it, and one of the things she said was, "Does it help to go through and clean up my photos?" And I said, "What do you mean by clean up your photos?" And she proceeds to explain to me that every so often she opens up her phone, she scrolls through the photos, and she takes the ones that she either doesn't want or where she took a bunch of duplicates of and, picks the best one and deletes the rest of them. And I inquired further as to why you would spend what I assume is a tremendous amount of time to free up a minuscule amount of disk space. I mean, how long does it take to go find what photo you want to keep and which 4 or 5 you're willing to delete? And oh, by the way, how sure are you that you're willing to part with those 4 or 5 photos for the, 16 megs it frees back up or whatever it is, right? And the further I got to talking to her, the more I realized that we didn't really have a concept of, well, if I delete this many photos, I'm going to free up this much space. It's just, I know my phone is running out of space. I know that I don't have unlimited space, so I need to prioritize what I'm going to keep. And it set in motion for me a series of thoughts that centered around the concept of, I can go buy more stuff. I can go buy more hard drives. I can go buy more stuff. I can't go back and retake pictures, recreate moments with my kids. That happened once and once only. And so whatever photos I have or videos I have or anything else is, in order of magnitude, more important to me than just about anything else I could purchase and or have. It certainly outranks any sort of streaming service or entertainment media that I would have via a subscription service. So if the only thing I did in life was take the same amount of money that I would put towards a Netflix or a Hulu or a Disney Plus, or you got to have all of them, Steve, so the kids have access to all the great content. You take all of that money and set it aside and instead put it into storage. I like the idea of storing my own stuff and never having to feel like I have to delete anything. Additionally, if I didn't have the infrastructure, the time, the effort, the knowledge, the know-how to set that up myself, that's where I think this Crunchbits or Spider Oak is a decent idea, where you can get 6 terabytes of bandwidth coverage. You get up to 2 terabytes of hard drive storage and 14 gigabytes of SSD storage.
So I guess the difference, though, between something like a Spider Oak and the Crunchbits is I believe that this is just a VPS with a giant disk attached to it, which means you're still doing something to it. So I'm not sure that that's in the same category or even in the same ballpark as Spider Oak, because one is still something that you have to manage. You have no control about it really after it leaves the system, except that you are responsible for all the redundancy.
Yeah, well, here's the other thing too. They have all the little so with Spider Oak, it's a complete end-to-end solution, right? I want to back stuff up. They give you a client, you point it at a directory, Bob's your uncle, you're done. In this case, you're getting access, as you so eloquently pointed out, to a server with a big hard drive attached. What would you like to do with that, right? And so, are you going to set up ZFS? Are you going to set up rsync? Are you going to set up C-File? Are you going to set up Nextcloud? How are you going to get the data from point A to point B? How are you going to back it up? How are you going to store? So anyway, so let's step through that a little bit. So if you woke up and you said to yourself, I'm Charlie and I want to go rent a VPS to do this, what are some ground rules? I assume that it starts with something like, I'm encrypting the data locally before I ever send it up to the cloud, because I ain't going to deal with the fact that they didn't encrypt it. I want to know it was encrypted before it ever left my system.
Yeah, I definitely would have to say encryption for sure, whether that's encrypting the files in flight, so like making a tarball and encrypting the tarball, or whether that's encrypting the disk that you're sending it to, the partition or whatever. They both have pros and cons. For example, if you had to recover from an encrypted disk problem, you might be able to recover from that easier because you don't have to have the GPG key, for example. So if I'm encrypting my individual files, I have to have a GPG key and then the password on top of that, and then those two things together make the tarball gibberish to anybody who has it. Meaning that if I lose the actual key, then I can't decrypt the stuff that I have. You're not going to have that exact same problem with the cloud storage thing out there, because it will store the key on the hard drive itself, and your password unlocks a series of keys to do the decryption for you. So as long as you know the password, in that case, you're going to be okay. So they have pros and cons, right? Which one are you worried about? Are you worried about somebody breaking into the system and stealing the raw files? Then you probably need to encrypt the files themselves. If you're worried about someone taking the drive out of your machine and, plugging it in somewhere else, then drive encryption will help you there.
So how would you store so we're not dealing with drive encryption because we don't, let's park that. I mean, that's one way to do it, right? You could encrypt the external drive and say but then every time you reboot it, you're going to have to, unencrypt it and all the things. Plus, I would argue that by encrypting the drive, if you're renting a VPS, means that by nature of encrypting the drive, unless you really went to some extraordinary measures, you're going to have the key on the box to be able to boot into it and decrypt the drive. Now, again, I get it, Lux, you can separate the key from the header, and so in theory, you could boot just the VM, you could SSH into it, you could load the key by hand, and then you could unencrypt the drive. However, so long as that drive is running, the key is going to be in memory, and so you're trusting it in somebody else's. Anyway, there's a lot of things I don't like about that, the entire drive method. If it's going to be in somebody else's possession and you have to decrypt it while in their possession in order to write or retrieve data to it. If you weren't going to do Spider Oak and you were going to roll something yourself, do you have any tools that immediately come to mind to you, Steve, that you would say, that's how I'd encrypt it before I sent it up? Or would you just GPG like a dog every one of those files or every one of those folders that you need, and then just send those up because, hey, it's trusted, it's been around for a long time, it's well understood, it ain't going anywhere.
Well, I mean, if Spider Oak went away tomorrow, I would definitely fall back to GPG just because that's what I know, and I would need something relatively short term. I haven't looked into this for a long time. I know there's tons of things about like encrypting a folder on your system. You've got, instead of Lux, you could do, help me out here. There's the project TrueCrypt, right?
Yep.
And then
TrueCrypt CryFS?
You could do CryFS. VeraCrypt was another one similar to TrueCrypt. Like you could do those sorts of things. So, I mean, I'm not really sure. I probably would default to GPG just because that's what I know.
So, this is interesting. Sleuth recommended Copia. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but fast and secure open source backup software. You can learn more by going to copia.io. I have a link for you in the show notes, podcast.asknoahshow.com. But basically, you pick the provider you want. So you choose Amazon S3, Azure, Blackblaze, Google Storage, WebDev, SFTP, rclone, whatever you want. And then you set up your own server by setting up a Copia repository server. And then it uses data duplication to send all that data back up. So it's an open source. Well, how would you describe this? An open source tool to get you what, Spider Oak gets you on your own thing?
I would say, yeah, I'd say it's a lightweight backup tool. And I mean lightweight because I'm thinking about Borg backup or,
yes.
The other one escapes me, but there's several of a similar ilk, which are really great for doing backups of fleets, but are significant overkill if you don't have, say, 10 computers.
What do you like about Borg or Restic? I mean, whichever one is you have more familiarity with.
Well, those tools in general, they do a lot for you, and that is useful in terms of the restoration process and the ability to have grandchildren and stuff like that. Okay, let me back up. If you've got a GPG encrypted file and you want to add to that or whatever, essentially what happens is you pull down the GPG file, you untar it, or like you decrypt it, untar it, put the thing in it, retar it, re-encrypt it, push it back out, right? And that's the way that you're doing your backup. If you're using something like a backup software that does this for you, like Borg or whatever, the way that they can work is additions go in as a child of the parent backup so that your individual backups can be incremental. In my GPG scenario, let's say I had a gig's worth of pictures and I wanted to just add one. It's a gig that I pull that down, I tar it back up, and a gig that I push back up plus whatever the size of the picture is in megs. Mm-hmm. Whereas you could get incremental style backups from something like Borg, which means that process would be significantly less bandwidth back and forth.
Is there a time where you would set up a ZFS pool on a remote drive and then just use ZFS send and receive to get data on and off a drive? Or is that, you think that's too much complexity to remotely set up on somebody else's hardware?
I don't know about somebody else's hardware, but I was going to involve you in a project next year where we'll build a shed in my backyard several 100 feet away from the house and trench some cable out there and do it that way.
Heck yeah, I'm down for that. So the reason the other people's hardware comes into play, or where I think that information is relevant, is from the standpoint that ZFS needs to have direct access to the drives. And so if you're renting hardware from somebody else, is drive caching on? Is it directly attached? Is it going through an HBA? Is it through a RAID system? Is it some sort of iSCSI thing with not knowing how they sell their block storage or set that up, that might give me some pause to deploy ZFS on it unless I knew the physical hardware that I was going into and the configuration of it.
I mean, that's fair. If I was going to do that, though, it would be more like, here's an Odroid with mirrored ZFS drives. Can you just stick this on your network somewhere and, use something like Tailscale and I push back and forth with Tailscale and here's $5 for your internet charge or whatever. Like, that's the way I would probably deal with that.
All right. So I hope this answers your question, and I hope that gives you some idea of what you would do in a backup situation. Again, above all else, encrypt it before you send it up anywhere on the internet. I like the idea. I think it's great that the internet has more and more places where you can rent space to store stuff on there. And then have a plan to get it back down. So whatever you store, run into people every so often that, I have 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 terabytes of stuff on Google Drive. Awesome. If Google charges you too much money or decides to rapidly upcharge or something changes in your situation, where are you going to land 70 terabytes worth of data?
From the Linux Newswire newsroom, this is the Week in Review with JT.
For the week of December 1st, 2024, here's the Linux and open source news. Rust 1.83 is out. Handbrake 1.9 is now available. Firefox 1.33 is now out. The Cinnamon desktop team has announced the release of version 6.4. Tails 6.10 has been released. NixOS 24.11 is out. And Ubuntu Touch OTA 7 is now available. And in security news, malware hunters at ESCT have announced the discovery of a prototype UEFI bootkit specifically targeting Ubuntu Linux configurations.
VMware is on the decline. Steve, this is something that I think is square up your alley. I'm not asking you to divulge anything private or sensitive, but in general, can you give me the rundown of what happened with Broadcom purchasing out VMware and how they're choosing the path they're choosing to take with their new acquisition?
So I'll give you my interpretation, because obviously the only people that really know what's going on is Broadcom. But from the outside perspective, a little bit of context. When people are evaluating a company, usually investors, the company is in one of three phases. They're either in a growth phase, they're in a sustain phase, which means they've built up their base and they are just quite happy with where they're at. They're considered like a commodity or something that is required in the industry, or they're serving their niche well. And so they're just kind of like, they're doing their best to maintain. And then there is the extract phase. And what the extract phase is at the point where investors think that there is a change in the market sufficient enough to mean that in 5, 10, 20 years, whatever time frame they set, your company's current portfolio is no longer going to serve the mainstream. And so this normally necessitates an increase in prices because the investors want to extract the value while you have some base that is still going to pay you because they can't get off right now, or it's very entrenched in their flow, whatever. For some reason, you're stuck there. It is my assertion that VMware was in the middle phase where they had a broad base. They were serving their customers relatively well. They were doing some level of innovation as to stay relevant, more or less. I mean, you see things like Tanzu and stuff where they were dipping their toes into the Kubernetes world. They were brought by Broadcom, and my thought is that Broadcom looked at this and said, you know what, at this phase of the game, we're still relevant, but we see a massive decline happening sometime in whatever time frame Broadcom evaluates these things. And therefore, we're going to start extracting as much value as we can while we still have a customer base. And what this does, in my mind, is when you start jacking up the price, you're going to shed a bunch of customers. Everybody knows that. But what you're going to do is you're going to lose the little fish, the guys that are probably causing support issues, and they're not paying for the extra fancy support, and they're chewing up cycles. And ultimately, the customer that has a $300,000 license is not as worth the headache in terms of maintaining the staff, in terms of like handling their queries and all the rest of that sort of stuff, as a company that might be 30 million, 50 million, pick a number for what their contract is. And so they're really trying to extract the maximum value that they can from their current base.
So this has led to companies discussing moving off of VMware. 1,000% price hike. 1,000% price hike. I can understand, Steve. I get it. Like I do. You know, you've got an old product. You don't want to support it anymore. There's a lot of technical cruft. There's a lot of expense that comes into hanging on to products for a long time. So to a degree, I get it. I understand what you're saying in the way of a company looks at how much road they think how much rubber is left on the road, so to speak, right? And you look down the road and you're like, hey, this train is going to come, this gravy train is going to come to an end. People needed us at one time. Now the industry is choosing differently. Instead of virtualization, we're going to cloud native technologies. Okay, fine. I can follow you up till that point. 1,000%? In what world does it make any sense to say 1,000%? There's one thing to say we're going to try to extract the most amount of money we can. There's another thing. It almost feels like, and I get this isn't accurate, but it almost feels like we're trying to drive people away.
Well, so let's be clear. 1,000% is not across the board, right? So they didn't just one day jack up all the prices on everybody 1,000%. All the way these companies work is they all have different deals that get negotiated. And just like you as a small business person have to evaluate a client that comes in, how much are they paying me versus how much of the resources are they tying up, and how nice are they? Honestly, sometimes
Yes.
that is that's a factor, right?
Absolutely, it is.
Are you just a jerk? Okay, I'll charge you 3 times as much, and if you want to pay for that, I guess I'll put up with what you're giving me. And so companies do the same thing. So all that to say is, like, to play the devil's advocate here a little bit, I can 100% tell you that they did not raise 1,000% across the board based on my sampling of customers. That doesn't mean it was insignificant. And some of the numbers that I saw were eye-watering, but 1,000% is, I think, a gross mischaracterization across the board.
Yeah, so I'm going off the ARS technical headline. The article digs into, say, between 300% and 1,000%, and I'll take your word that it just varies. But I think there's an opportunity here, Steve. There's an opportunity from the standpoint that companies, the need for virtualization isn't going to go away. It might change, it might evolve, and certainly some things that we were doing with virtualization, we might find more efficient ways to do that. With containers and cloud native stuff. So great, more power to you if we can. But I think we're always going to need containers in some form. It's of note to me that VMware was the 500-pound gorilla in the room. And again, at least if my understanding of the situation is correct, it seems like they see the writing on the wall and that the open source alternatives are going to be the thing where people land. Do you have any experience and or an opinion on OpenNebula, a competitor to VMware that I understand is quite compelling?
I don't really have any experience. I'm familiar with them being out there, but honestly, my day-to-day, I haven't really bumped into them.
So I haven't either. I think you and I are on the same boat insofar as we just do everything with Virt Manager, or, well, libvirt. So the thing that is, I guess, of note to me or of interest to me, OpenNebula advertises that they are an open source cloud and edge computing platform. So they sell a subscription, and the idea is that you're buying open source enterprise tools and support. I don't know. I look at this and I look at some of the things that are here and I think, man, this is not bad. And the other thing is, you go look at some of the screenshots for things like OpenNebula, and I look at it and I go, you know what? That's approachable. I feel like if they've got some YouTube videos that show getting various different things set up, a Prometheus integration and deploying OpenNebula and those sorts of things. And as I look at some of those things, I can kind of see them. I'm interested. I guess I think what would sell it for me is if we get to a place to where there is more industry pull in one box over the other. So I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. There is no shortage of our friends, listeners of the show, people that work in the IT industry that immediately gravitate towards Proxmox. In fact, people just like it. It's established. It's been around for a long time. It has high availability and all of the enterprisey things that we like. So I guess it's not surprising to me that there are a number of different entities moving over to all manner of different solutions. But as I watch some people land in the libvirt camp, and as I watch some people aren't, they're still using VirtualBox for various things. A bunch of different virtualization technologies have all kind of taken off, and everybody kind of lands in their own camp. I'm waiting for one to kind of rise above the rest, but yet has the simplicity and elegance that I've come to expect from libvirt. And whatever solution that happens to be, I'll dive in with both hands. But at the moment, as it stands today, Steve, I really like installing a base operating system, installing a handful of packages, and I have a virtual host. I don't need a web UI. I don't need some administrative dashboard. I don't want to have to create huge, storage pools and VM pools. It's just, I want to start a VM up. I want to give it some RAM. I want to give it a disk. I want to point it to an ISO file, and I want to get about the business of running a VM. That's what I want. And I get that from libvirt. It might be an interesting time. We've touched on it in the past. Could you talk a little bit about the talk that you've given and some of the exploration you've done with taking libvirt and placing it into a container to make it do some of the things that we would do with container orchestration technology without having a full-on, I don't want a full-on OpenShift thing. I just want a virtual host.
So, I mean, the stuff that we've talked about in the past on this show and at some conferences actually revolves around the KubeVirt project, which does actually spin up an entire, or requires a Kubernetes cluster of some description.
Okay.
However, the TLDR is containers are just Linux. And while we have the perception that they are binaries, they are not binaries. They are just simply processes running on the Linux kernel that the kernel keeps separate from everything else. So it is 100% possible to spin up libvirt in a container and have it do all the virtualization stuff inside of a container, because again, a container is just a fancy word for I have 7 or 8 different namespaces and C groups combined together, which are Linux kernel processes used to determine what things should have access to network and disk and CPU and all that sort of stuff. So there's nothing fancy going on here. It is your Linux machine just doing work in a sandboxed environment.
The advantage of putting it in that sandbox environment, though, is it opens up some additional flexibility and capabilities by way of sliding those containers around, right?
Sure. Honestly, there isn't any particular advantage there from using libvirt underneath, like on Metal, and doing the migration. Because essentially what happens is when you're talking about sliding these containers around, usually in the context of virtualization, you're thinking about migrating the VM that is running inside of that container. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
So in that case, you still require a level of shared storage. And what is happening under the hood is a new libvirt process is spun up on a different host and then is activating the libvirt live migration function, which already exists in libvirt. So there's no particular difference if you're not doing this at scale from having 2 boxes that have libvirt with shared storage and just doing a live migration that way, and having libvirt in a container and then moving the container from one host to another and then having it do the libvirt migration.
Very good. 1-855-450-NOAH, 855-450-6624. The email live at asknoahshow.com. We'd love to have you join us. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea of what's going on in the VMware land and virtualization, and hopefully gives you some context and some ideas as some different ways that you could address some of those same problems. So, Steve, we have had a few different episodes now talking a little bit about what it looks like to be driving Linux day to day. And you've been kind and vulnerable enough to share some of your experiences with what it's like to be a first-class Linux citizen. And there's been a number of different discussions that have happened both on air as well as in between and before and after the show. And it's caused me to do a tremendous amount of reflection and a tremendous amount of thinking about what the experience is like on desktop Linux. And so before I share some of that, I guess I want to start with where we left off. You were having trouble with your NVIDIA graphics card. The idea, or something that you were kicking around, was the idea of purchasing an Intel Arc card. For those that aren't familiar, Intel Arc is a PCI graphics card made by Intel. So in theory, you should get the same reliability, same performance that you'd get out of the integrated Intel cards. But this is one that you can plug into a PCI card. You get a little bit of extra boom for your buck by way of a dedicated graphics card, but one that's made by Intel. So Black Friday has come and gone. Did an Intel Arc card make its way into your Christmas basket? And if so, what were the results?
So to be clear, I suspect that the NVIDIA card was giving me problems. I had no proof on this, right? The symptom was that the system was struggling to wake up from sleep frequently and with no real things in the log. So you wake the computer up from sleep and you just get a black screen. If you were running GNOME, it would eventually turn to the gray screen that was like, uh-oh, something went wrong, and then crashes GDM. If it was KDE, it just stayed black. There was nothing to be done about it. Just kind of hung out there and did nothing. So that was the symptom, and I suspected it was a video card. So I was on the hunt for the Arc card because, like Noah said, the thought is the drivers that are built into the kernel are going to be better supported for things like suspend and resume, because on those ThinkPads that Noah loves to recommend, you close those lids and open them up and it's almost instantaneous, right? The suspend and resume on all of my laptops has been phenomenal. And so that's why I suspected it was the graphics card. So I ended up picking up an A770, which is the biggest Arc card that is currently out, although I understand there's new generations coming soon. And I swapped out the video card, and the first thing that I did was just did a full-scale swap, just pulled the old one out, put the new one in, fired it up, ran some benchmarks, and the performance was subpar. And so, like, significantly subpar. Some of the, just a flavor of this, one of the benchmarks that I ran out of several, the benchmark ran at about 94 frames a second on the RTX 3060 and ran at 18 on the Arc A770. By the specs, it's supposed to be somewhere between a 3060 and a 4060 in terms of performance. So I was expecting equivalent, not 90% loss. When I looked into it, I saw that it was using the i915 driver, which is intended for the integrated GPU. And the recommendation, I'll put that in air quotes, to use the XE driver because that's really meant for the discrete graphics card. I played around with it. I had a bunch of problems which were self-inflicted. I run the LTS kernel, and so I had a bunch of packages that were built against the LTS kernel, and the XE driver requires not the LTS kernel because it needs a really new one. And so I had to untangle all of that, and I finally got that working. And the XE driver, while slightly faster, did weird things like it only turned on 2 of the 3 monitors. So I packed it up and shipped it back. I considered hanging on to it from the perspective of the drivers are getting better. Like I tried the Linux 610 kernel and they weren't there. Not for me, right? I didn't do suspend and resume, and I didn't do all that kind of testing because of the various bumps in Blender and some video games and stuff like that. The card just wasn't going to do it for me, and I didn't think that there was a good reason to just park it on the shelf and hope that drivers are going to get better in 6 months.
So Intel Arc card is gone. We're back to NVIDIA. and we'll carry on that way.
Yep. I think so. Throughout all this process, we mentioned the playbook that I have been working on, or a series of tasks, Ansible tasks, to reinstall Arch with ZFS on root. That has gotten battle tested to to the furthest degree, because I've done, I don't know, a dozen reinstalls in the last week. And as a consequence of that, I moved over to Cinnamon, like we mentioned last week, and I haven't noticed any problems with resuming from sleep, other than it's slower than my laptop by magnitudes, 3 seconds. But at least the desktop doesn't crash and I don't lose all my windows. So
that is a step in the right direction. Yes, I agree. So having listened to this and watched this experience unfold, one of the things, and this doesn't come as any surprise to most people, is that I have a passion for getting people to use Linux, giving it a shot, trying to see what works, trying to see what doesn't work. And this experience has definitely shaped the way I view those things and how I have those conversations. And so one of the things that I am going to try to do is I published at docs.minddrip1.com. We'll have a link for you in the show notes at podcast.asknoahshow.com, getting started with Linux. And the idea here is, I think that technology is best when it's reproducible, when it's shareable, and when it's sustainable. You remove any one of those things where I can't reproduce it, you set it up for me, but I can't get back to where I was, or something happened or something ran and it's in a great state now, but if I ever went back, I wouldn't be able to re-achieve that state. If I can't share it with the next person, it has a shelf life. It absolutely does. If it's not sustainable, it has a shelf life and I'll have to get rid of it. So it needs to be reproducible, it has to be shareable, and it has to be sustainable. If you set out with that goal in mind, I suspect you arrive pretty quickly at open source, because open source, and particularly Linux, is going to empower you to leverage the technology to its full potential. Linux doesn't care when you pull a computer out of the box, when you pull a desktop and put all the pieces together. It doesn't really care where you got the license or when you bought the computer or what hardware is there. It's going to do its level best to let you use that hardware to its full potential. And so when we make an intentional choice to choose open source code and invest in code that's shareable and that's sustainable and that's reproducible, it's a way of being and exercising being good stewards of technology. So I put all of that out into a doc, and I started to break it down. If somebody sat at my dinner table and said, Noah, I'm interested in a computer, what should I buy? I would tell that person to not buy a computer that has anything less than 16 gigabytes of RAM. Now, if you know what you're looking for, if you know what your requirements are, but no, I use 4 gigabytes of RAM all the time. The only thing I do is open Firefox and I go to Proton Mail. Okay, if you know it works, by all means, carry on. But if you don't really know what you're getting into and you've listened to the show, or maybe you're the first time you're listening to the show and you're hearing me say Linux and open source, and yeah, I'm interested in owning my own tech, but I have no idea where to get started with a computer that has 16 gigs of RAM. Get started with a computer that has 512 gigabytes of storage. Get started with a computer that has an i5 or better that was made within the last 5 to 7 years. Once you have that framework of hardware, you can choose what you want to buy. Now, if you're looking for budget friendly, Steve has already called this out. I'm a big fan of ThinkPads, specifically the T480. They're inexpensive. They start at $150, 14-inch screen. It has Thunderbolt. It'll go up to 16 gigs of RAM. The parts are user replaceable, and it's built like a tank, so it's going to last you for a good long time. You want something that isn't owned by a Chinese company, made by a Chinese company? Well, the Dell Latitude 7410. Same 14-inch computer, still gives you Thunderbolt. You're going to pay a little bit extra, but the build quality is going to be, I think, worth the extra money. 13-inch, are you in that boat? I'm in that boat. I don't like having extra elbow room when I'm on airplanes. Let me rephrase. I want the extra elbow room. I don't have it. So I must use a 13-inch laptop so that I can work anywhere. I carry a Dell Latitude 7330. I really like it. It's fantastic. And so if you're looking for a used computer, it's a great way to go. If you have the budget to buy a new computer, you're going to get more longevity out of a newer computer, I think, if you purchase from a company that wants you to run Linux on it. System 76, top of that list. Right under them, Framework. Star Labs and Tuxedo Computers are both examples of other OEMs that manufacture distro-specific computers. So depending on if you're an OpenSUSE person or a KDE person or whatever, you might be able to find an OEM manufacturer that manufactures hardware specifically for your distro. Well, again, all those will be linked at docs.minddrip1.com. We'll have a link in the show notes at podcast.asknoahshow.com. When you go to actually run a distro, there's a couple of ways you can do that. The first is you just want to try it. You don't want to make any changes to the computer. It's a computer that you're borrowing. It's a computer that you're trying. You're trying to get your feet wet with Linux. For those things, stuff like NLOS and Tails work really well because you can boot them right off the flash drive and you can continue to run them. But as soon as you restart the computer, it's going to boot back to its original storage drive and you're going to get back into whatever operating system with all the data that was already on there. So it's the ability to try before you buy. Once you decide you want to make it your permanent home, that's when we're going to look at distros like Linux Mint, like Ubuntu, like OpenSUSE, Fedora. And we're going to leave Endless OS in there because both Steve and I really like it for day-to-day stuff. If you outgrow your home distro, that's when you start getting into very opinionated and or very flavorful distros to where you get to choose the desktop environment. You're going to choose what packages are there. You're going to choose how that distro comes together. Those are the Arches, the NixOSs of the world. And finally, when you're done with your Linux journey, when you upgrade your computer, when you move on, when you buy something new, make it endless. When you're done with a computer, I would encourage you in the strongest possible terms to leave it in a state with the next user in mind. So when the next person picks up that laptop and they power it up or they plug it in, they have a usable functional tool that they can either use locally or connect it to the internet and get connected to something else. Endless OS in specific makes it very easy to do that because by default, it's going to create an account without a password. So that enables everybody that's using the computer to have an easy and welcoming way to approach new users, that they can just pick the thing up and start using it. And GNOME, pretty dang approachable. So I think we do a good job at some of the early things. I think we're good at trying distros. I think we're definitely, as nerds, we're good at buying hardware. I think where we fall down a little bit is when that hardware starts to get to that 5 to 7 year end of life cycle, put something on it that's sustainable and hand it off to the next person. Anything to add to that, Steve, or does that seem like a pretty reasonable, hey, if you're bootstrapping Linux for Christmas, this might be the way you do it?
Yeah, I would just wholeheartedly recommend Endless OS, especially if you don't do the fat install. So it's got two different install modes. It's got the full install, which is, it just loads all of the things, which is great if you want to give it to a kid and have all the games and stuff like that. If you want to have a base to install from, so anything that drives a projector or a screen in my house is Endless OS with the base install. And it's wonderful. I just works. I can't say, yeah, that's exactly it. It does its thing, and I never have a problem with it.
The way I have chosen to describe Endless OS to people that ask is I describe it like a Chromebook. And it sets the expectation that if you're there to primarily use a web browser, it's going to work really well. But the immutability of Endless OS means that users have the ability to stumble around without ever stubbing their toe. And what I found by just taking computers, loading them with Endless and throwing them around, just leaving them there. Now, I don't say anything. I don't ask anybody. Here's a computer, it's Endless OS, and it's just sitting there. What you find is people go reaching for a tool. They want to view something online. They want to add something. They want to stream something. They want to watch something on a TV. Endless OS makes it so that they can do that. So there's my spiel on getting started with Linux. Music in our ears means we're at the end of the show. I appreciate you joining us. We're live every Tuesday, 6 p.m. Central. You can get the entire back catalog as well as the show notes at podcast.asknoahshow.com. We'll see you next Tuesday, 6 p.m. Central, asknoahshow.com.